What would you do if you believed the justice system was being weaponized against political dissent? Would you stay silent or would you take action? Well, on January 20th of 2025, Donald Trump answered that question in a way that only a president can, by pardoning over 1,500 people connected to the January 6, 2021 Capitol attack. And it wasn't just controversial, it was unprecedented. For some, these pardons were an act of courage, a bold stance against political lawfare. For others, they were reckless, a move that undercut accountability and emboldened future misconduct. But the truth, as often, it lies somewhere in the middle. Today, we're doing a deep dive into Trump's mass pardons, exploring the legal, historical, and moral questions they raise. By the end of this video, you'll have the tools to decide, were these pardons an act of justice or a political statement, or both? Let's get into it. The scale of these pardons is almost impossible to overstate. Over 1,500 people have been pardoned and 450 pending cases are now dismissed. So what exactly did Trump do? On his first day back in office, he issued a sweeping executive order granting full pardons to the vast majority of the January 6 defendants. And in many cases, they weren't just for minor trespassing charges either. The pardons and commutations included people convicted of seditious conspiracy, a crime aimed at overthrowing or hindering the government, and others who assaulted law enforcement officers. Trump has also commuted the sentences of 14 individuals, including leaders of groups like the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, who had been convicted of organizing violent plots. The executive order went even further by directing federal prosecutors to dismiss any pending charges with prejudice, meaning those charges can never be refiled. In one stroke of the pen, Trump dismantled years of legal efforts by the Department of Justice. But why would Trump take such a drastic step? To answer that, we need to examine the broader context of these prosecutions. Were these prosecutions about enforcing the law, or were they a political weapon aimed at Trump supporters? The answer, of course, depends on your perspective. Critics of the January 6 prosecution have argued the Department of Justice went overboard. Yes, these were in some situations violent acts, and yes, in some situations law enforcement officers were harmed. But not everyone who entered the Capitol that day was a violent insurrectionist. Some people walked in after doors were already opened, in some cases believing they were exercising their First Amendment rights. Others committed nonviolent offenses, like parading or trespassing, yet in some cases faced significant penalties. Supporters of the Trump pardons believe the Justice Department's actions were politically motivated, targeting individuals because of their support for Trump rather than the severity of their actions. They point out that similar political protests, like those that occurred during the summer of 2020, in those cases perpetrated by BLM and Antifa, did not result in the same level of federal prosecution. On the other hand, proponents of the prosecution argue the January 6 riot was not a typical protest. It was an attack on democracy itself, timed to disrupt the certification of an election. For those people, holding individuals accountable was about protecting democracy, not about politics. To understand whether Trump's actions were justified, it helps to look at how past presidents have used their pardon power in sometimes controversial ways. This isn't the first time a president has used pardons to address a politically charged situation. So, how does Trump's decision stack up against history? Presidential pardons have often been controversial, especially when tied to politically sensitive events. Take, for example, George Washington's pardons after the Whiskey Rebellion of 1795. In that case, a group of farmers violently resisted federal taxes, taking up arms directly against the United States. And while Washington used military force to restore order, he later pardoned those leaders to promote unity. Then there's the case of Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, who together issued pardons to Confederate soldiers after the Civil War. Their goal? To help heal a divided nation. But not all those pardons came without backlash. Johnson's broad pardons for wealthy Confederates were criticized for letting those who caused the war to regain power too quickly. Fast forward to Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon after the Watergate scandal. Ford believed the nation needed to move on, but many saw it as a corrupt deal that denied accountability for a nation's leader. Similarly, Jimmy Carter's amnesty for all the draft dodgers from the Vietnam War draft evaders helped to heal the nation torn apart by the war, though it faced criticism from veterans and families who saw it as unfair to those who served. Compared to these historical examples, Trump's pardons stand out for their sheer scale and their focus on a politically charged event. But like past presidents, Trump has framed his decision as an act of reconciliation, arguing that these prosecutions represent a grave injustice. Now that we've seen the historical parallels, let's dive into the legal mechanics of these pardons. Did you know that the president's pardon power is almost absolute? It's sometimes called plenary. It's one of the most sweeping powers of the Constitution and is held by the president and the president alone. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution gives the president a broad power to pardon for any federal offense. The power is broad, so broad, in fact, that a president can pardon someone for any federal crime, even if they haven't been charged yet. The only limitation? Pardons cannot apply to state crimes, nor can it get someone out of being impeached, which itself is a political rather than legal act. Trump's use of this power to pardon the January 6 defendants was entirely legal, even if controversial. Critics will argue that his actions undermine the rule of law, but of course, Trump supporters see it very differently. They view pardons as a necessary check against what they see as dramatic overreach by the Biden Department of Justice. It's worth noting that Trump's decision to pardon individuals convicted of violent crimes, like assaulting law enforcement, is fairly unusual. Past presidents have typically drawn a line between violent and non-violent offenders when granting clemency, but of course not in every situation or every case. See by, for example, the Confederate soldiers who were pardoned despite the fact they took up arms during a civil war. By breaking with this tradition, Trump has sent a strong signal. He believed that these prosecutions are fundamentally unjust regardless of the nature of the offense. But beyond the legality, let's talk about the human stories behind some of these pardons, the people that have been affected, and how their lives were changed for the worse. So who were the people who were caught up in this January 6th incident? And why did Trump believe that these people deserve clemency? Among those pardoned were high-profile figures like Enrique Tarrio, the leader of the Proud Boys, and Stewart Rhodes, the founder of the Oath Keepers. Both of them were convicted of seditious conspiracy, a rare and serious charge, and in both cases got decades in prison. Trump commuted their sentences to time served, arguing that the cases against them were politically motivated. Then there were the everyday Americans caught up in the chaos. Take, for example, Isabella Marie De Luca, a social media influencer who was charged with moving a table that rioters later used as a barricade. Or Jacob Hiles, a Virginia fisherman who pled guilty to the misdemeanor of trespassing but had his life turned upside down. For people like these, the pardons offer a second chance, freeing them from what they saw as disproportionate punishment. At the heart of many of these stories is a common theme. Many of these defendants felt that they were being punished not for what they did, but for their political beliefs. Trump's pardons grants them relief, and in some cases, vindication. But of course, not everyone sees these pardons as victory. Let's address the criticism and broader implications. Not surprisingly, these pardons have sparked outrage. But what does it mean for the future of justice and accountability? Critics argue that Trump's pardon undermined the rule of law by excusing violent behavior. Law enforcement officials like Michael Fanone, who was assaulted during the Capitol riot, have expressed their feelings of betrayal. For them, the pardons erase sacrifices they made to defend democracy. On the other hand, Trump supporters argued that the real betrayal came from the justice system itself that was weaponized against political dissent. They believe that January 6 prosecutions were politically motivated in an effort to silence opposition, and pardons are a necessary correction. Looking ahead, these pardons set a precedent that could shape future administrations. How will future presidents feel emboldened to use clemency in perhaps a political fashion? Or will this incident serve as a cautionary tale about the limits of pardon power? Let's bring this all together and leave you with some questions to ponder. Trump's January 6 pardons were bold, controversial, and deeply consequential. Whether you see them as an act of justice or a political maneuver, they raise important questions about fairness, accountability, and the power of the presidents. But now it's time to hear from you. And here are 3 questions to keep the conversation going. Were these pardons a necessary correction to political overreach, or do you believe they undermine the rule of law? Do you believe presidents should have such broad power to pardon, or do you think there should be limits to prevent potential abuse? And finally, if these weren't Trump supporters, would the outrage or the support be the same? Drop your thoughts in the comments section below. I can't wait to see what you have to say about this. Until next time, I've been Uncivil Law, and remember, to keep it uncivil out there.